You walked in and the smell hit you before you found a seat. Grease, onions, and something sweet baking in the back. The menu was short, nothing on it over $2, and the woman behind the counter already knew what you wanted. That was a Black-owned diner in the South, and most of them are gone now. Number 16 served something most people today would not touch, and the regulars ordered it without hesitating. Number 6 cleared half the counter, and the other half never ordered anything else. And the dish at number 1 carries roots older than any line this country ever drew. These diners fed communities that the rest of the country pretended did not exist. Hit subscribe because this history runs deeper than food. Here are 25 dishes from Black-owned diners of the South that no longer exist. Number 25, smothered liver and onions. Slices of beef liver dusted in seasoned flour, seared hard in a hot skillet, then buried under a mound of sliced onions and covered with a lid until the onions went soft and the gravy thickened from the flour and the meat drippings. Served with rice or mashed potatoes and a piece of cornbread to push through the last of the gravy. The liver had a mineral taste that no other cut of beef could replicate, and the people who ate it did not need to be convinced. They grew up on it. Diners from Atlanta to Shreveport kept liver and onions on the Tuesday or Wednesday menu when the weekend meats were gone and the kitchen needed something cheap that tasted rich. The plate cost next to nothing. The customers who ordered it never looked at the rest of the board. Number 24, pickled pig feet. Whole hog feet, clean, split, simmered until tender, then packed into jars with vinegar, salt, peppercorns, bay leaves, and hot pepper flakes. They sat on the diner counter in a glass jar, visible to anyone who walked in, and the regulars pointed at the jar without speaking. The feet had a slippery, gelatinous texture that took getting used to, and the vinegar cut through the richness just enough to keep a person reaching for the next piece. Eating one required both hands and a willingness to gnaw around small bones. No fork, no pretense. A pickled pig foot with crackers and hot sauce was a full meal for someone who did not want to wait for the kitchen to fire up something hot. When the diner closed, the jar went home with the cook, and the counter where it sat became an empty shelf in somebody else's building. Number 23, pork chop sandwich. A bone-in pork chop fried in a cast iron skillet, pressed flat between two slices of white bread with mustard and pickles. The bone stuck out one side and the bread soaked through from the grease before the plate reached the counter. This was the working lunch at diners near sawmills, rail yards, and cotton gins from East Texas to the Carolina Piedmont. A man could eat it with one hand and be back on the line in 15 minutes. The chop was pounded thin so it cooked fast, and the seasoning was salt, pepper, and whatever paprika or garlic powder the cook had on the shelf. Nobody called it a sandwich on the menu. It was listed as a pork chop plate, and the bread came on the side. The customers made the sandwich themselves. Number 22, hamburger steak with onion gravy. A thick patty of ground beef, wider than a hamburger bun, and seasoned with salt, pepper, and Worcestershire, seared in a skillet until the outside browned, then covered in a dark gravy made from the drippings, sliced onions, and a spoonful of flour, served with rice or mashed potatoes and green beans from a can heated on the back burner. The hamburger steak was the diner's answer to a real steak dinner at a fraction of the cost. The gravy disguised the grade of the meat and gave the whole plate a richness that justified sitting down. Diners that served it charged less for this plate than for anything with bone-in pork or chicken. It fed a person fully, it cost the kitchen almost nothing, and the gravy alone was worth the walk through the door. Number 21, pepper steak over rice. Thin strips of round steak seared hard in a smoking skillet, then simmered with sliced bell peppers, onions, and tomato until the meat went tender and the vegetables collapsed into a thick sauce. Spooned over white rice. This plate showed up at Black-owned diners in cities like Memphis and Houston, where Chinese American takeout traditions had mixed with Southern cooking decades earlier. The steak was cheap because the cut was tough. The slow simmering fixed that. By the time the plate reached the counter, the meat pulled apart with a fork and the sauce had soaked into every grain of rice. A person who had never ordered it watched the plate cross the counter and changed their mind before the cook had a chance to ask what they wanted. Number 20, sardine patties. Canned sardines mashed with a fork, mixed with cornmeal, diced onion, an egg, salt, and pepper, shaped into flat cakes and fried in hot oil until both sides turned crisp and golden. Served on a plate with white bread and hot sauce, or between two slices as a sandwich. The sardines gave the patty a strong, briny flavor that no freshwater fish could match, and the cornmeal held everything together without making it heavy. A can of sardines cost almost nothing, and 2 cans made enough patties to feed a table of 4. This was the Friday fish plate at diners that could not get fresh catfish delivered that week. The tin sat on the shelf until it was needed, and it was always needed sooner than anyone planned. These diners did not exist by accident. For most of the 20th century, across the American South, Black families could not eat at white-owned lunch counters. They were turned away at the door, refused service at the register, or pointed toward a back window where they could order but never sit, so they built their own places, small storefronts, converted houses, rooms attached to barbershops or beauty parlors. The food was Southern, the prices were low, and the dining room was the one public space in town where a Black man or woman could sit at a table, order a meal, and not be humiliated. These diners did more than feed people. They employed cooks, waitresses, and dishwashers. They hosted first dates and funeral repasts. They cashed checks for regulars who could not get to a bank. When one closed, the neighborhood lost more than a restaurant. It lost a room where people belonged. Number 19, beef tongue. A whole cow tongue simmered for hours in salted water with onion and bay leaf until the outer skin peeled away and the meat underneath turned tender enough to slice with a butter knife. Served cold on white bread with mustard or hot with gravy and rice. The tongue had a smooth, dense texture unlike any other cut of beef, and it carried more flavor per ounce than most roasts because the muscle never stopped working during the animal's life. Diners that served tongue kept it in the back kitchen, sliced to order, and it never appeared on a chalkboard out front. The cook told regulars it was available, and the regulars told nobody. It was an insider plate, and the people who ate it treated it that way. When the butcher stopped selling whole tongues because nobody under 40 knew what to do with one, the plate disappeared without anyone noticing, except the people who had been eating it for years. Number 18, fried green tomatoes. Unripe tomatoes, sliced thick, dipped in buttermilk, dredged in cornmeal, and fried in a skillet until the crust turned golden and the inside stayed firm with a sharp, sour bite. Served as a side with fish or pork, or stacked on a plate as a light meal with salt and pepper. The green tomato was a garden product that ripened on no schedule, and when too many came in at once, frying was the fastest way to use them before they turned. Diners near farms served them in late summer when the tomato vines were still producing, but the fruit had not yet colored. The dish required nothing expensive and tasted like something that cost more than it did. When the garden behind the diner was paved over, the green tomatoes stopped coming. Number 17, pigtails and rice. Sections of pigtail braised in a pot with onion, garlic, vinegar, salt, pepper, and a touch of sugar until the cartilage softened and the meat fell loose from the small bones. Spooned over white rice with the braising liquid poured on top. The tails were fatty and rich, and the vinegar in the pot cut through the heaviness so the plate did not sit like a stone. This was a plate that required patience. The tails needed hours before they gave up their texture, and a cook who rushed them ended up with something chewy and unpleasant. Diners that served pigtails did not put them on the menu for newcomers. They were a signal to the regulars that the cook had been at the stove since before dawn, and the people who recognized that signal ordered without asking the price. Number 16, hog maw, the clean stomach lining of a hog stuffed with a mixture of sausage, potatoes, onion, and seasoning, sewn shut and baked or simmered until the casing turned tender and the filling cooked through. Sliced thick and served on a plate with greens or potato salad. This was the dish that divided a diner in half. The people who ate hog maw ate it with devotion, and the people who did not eat it looked at the plate with something close to alarm. The preparation took hours. The cleaning alone was a job nobody volunteered for twice, but a properly cooked hog maw had a richness that came from the casing itself, almost gelatinous, salty, and deeply flavored by the sausage and onion packed inside. When the last diner cook who knew how to clean and stuff one retired, the dish left the menu for good. Number 15, tripe stew. Honeycomb tripe cleaned, boiled, cut into strips, and simmered with tomatoes, onion, bell pepper, garlic, and hot pepper until the tripe turned tender and the sauce thickened around it. Served in a deep bowl with rice or bread on the side. The tripe had a chewy, almost rubbery texture that softened the longer it cooked, and the stew surrounding it was rich enough to carry a meal on its own. A pound of tripe cost less than any cut of muscle meat at the butcher, and a single pot fed a full lunch service. The customers who ate tripe stew at these diners were rarely trying it for the first time. They had eaten it as children, prepared by someone who knew how to clean it properly, and they measured every bowl they ordered against that original memory. Number 14, egg custard pie. A simple filling of eggs, sugar, butter, vanilla, and milk poured into a homemade pie crust and baked until the custard set firm and the top developed a thin, golden skin that wrinkled when the pie cooled. No fruit, no chocolate, no meringue, just custard in the crust, and the people who ordered a slice at a black-owned diner in the South knew exactly what they were asking for. The egg custard pie was the oldest dessert on most diner menus, older than the sweet potato pie and older than the cobblers. It came from a time when eggs, butter, and milk were what a household had, and turning them into something sweet was a matter of knowing the proportions by feel. A cook who overbaked the custard got a rubbery texture. A cook who underbaked it got a puddle. The window between the two was narrow, and a cook who hit it every time did not learn from a book. This pie showed up at funeral repasts, church suppers, and Sunday dinners before it ever sat under glass at a diner counter. The version served in diners was usually plainer than the home version. No nutmeg, no coconut, just the clean taste of eggs and vanilla with a buttery crust that crumbled when the fork pressed through. The simplicity was what people came for. A person eating egg custard pie was not looking for a spectacle. They were looking for something that tasted the way the kitchen smelled when someone in the family was still alive to bake it. Diners sold it by the slice, and a full pie disappeared by mid-afternoon on most days. The cook baked 2 or 3 at a time and set them on the counter in a row, and the regulars who came in after the lunch rush knew to look for the last slice before they looked at anything else. When the cook retired, the pie left with her. The recipe was simple enough for anyone to follow, but the hand that poured the custard and pulled the pie from the oven at the right second was not something a recipe could replace. Number 13, fried bologna sandwich. A thick slice of bologna scored around the edges so it would not curl, fried in a skillet until the outside browned and the center puffed up slightly, then placed on white bread with mustard, a slice of raw onion, and sometimes a smear of mayonnaise. The sandwich cost almost nothing to make and even less to order. Bologna was the cheapest sliced meat the diner could stock, and frying it changed the flavor from something mild and rubbery into something smoky and crisp at the edges. Children ate it after school, adults ate it when the paycheck had not come yet. The fried bologna sandwich never pretended to be more than it was, and the people who ordered it never needed it to be. Number 12, sweet potato pone. Raw sweet potatoes, grated by hand, mixed with sugar, butter, eggs, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a pour of cane syrup, then baked in a cast iron skillet or deep baking pan until the top formed a dark, caramelized crust and the inside turned dense and sticky. This was not a pie. It had no crust underneath. It was closer to a pudding that held its own shape, sliced into squares and served warm or at room temperature. The grating was the hardest part. A cook's knuckles knew the difference between a potato pone day and every other day because the grater took skin along with the sweet potato if the hand slipped. The pone itself lasted for days on the counter without going stale, which made it a diner dessert that earned its keep. Bake it once, sell it all week. Number 11, fatback and biscuit plate, thick slabs of cured pork fatback, sliced thin, fried in a dry skillet until the edges turned crisp and the fat rendered out golden into the pan, served on a plate with 2 or 3 biscuits split open and a cup of the rendered drippings poured into a small bowl for dipping. The plate cost less than anything else on the menu because fatback was the cheapest cut the butcher had. It was pure fat with the strip of skin on one side, and eating it required no apology in a room full of people who understood that fat was fuel, and fuel was what got a person through a day of labor. The biscuit soaked up the drippings and became something between bread and gravy. Nobody ordered this plate for a celebration. They ordered it to get through Tuesday. Nobody talks about this part enough. Many of these diners did not close because the food got worse or the customers stopped being hungry. They closed because the world around them changed in ways that made survival almost impossible. Interstate highways cut through black neighborhoods and wiped out the foot traffic that kept small businesses alive. Urban renewal programs bulldozed entire commercial blocks. And after the Civil Rights Act opened the doors of white-owned restaurants, some of the same customers who had sustained black-owned diners for decades began eating elsewhere. The paradox of integration was that the freedom to eat anywhere meant fewer reasons to eat at the place that had always welcomed you. Chain restaurants moved into southern towns with lower prices, longer hours, and national advertising budgets that no single-room diner could match. One by one, the diners went dark, not because they failed, but because the ground they stood on was pulled out from under them. Number 10, chili over spaghetti. A thick, slow-cooked chili made with ground beef, tomato, onion, garlic, chili powder, and cumin, ladled over a plate of boiled spaghetti noodles and topped with diced raw onion and a handful of saltine crackers on the side. This was not an Italian dish and not a Tex-Mex dish. It was a diner plate that belonged to the cooks who invented it, and it showed up at black-owned diners from Memphis to Birmingham in the middle of the 20th century. The noodles stretched the chili further than rice could, and a single pot of chili over a case of dry spaghetti could feed a dining room for an entire day. The cook made the chili early in the morning and let it reduce on the stove until the liquid was nearly gone, and what remained was thick enough to sit on top of the noodles, without running to the edges of the plate. Some cooks added kidney beans, others swore the beans ruined it and kept the chili as straight meat and tomato. The argument never settled, and the customers who preferred one version refused to eat at the diner that served the other. A town with 2 Black-owned diners could have 2 completely different versions of chili spaghetti, and each one had a following that would not cross the street. The plate was not pretty. It arrived in a deep bowl with the chili pooling around the noodles and the crackers already going soft at the edge. But it was hot, it was filling, and it was the kind of food that a person ate alone at the counter on a cold night without feeling like the night had beaten them. When the last diner that served it closed, the recipe scattered into home kitchens where it still shows up on weeknights in houses that remember where it came from. Number 9, meatloaf with brown, gravy, ground beef stretched with breadcrumbs, diced onion, an egg, and enough seasoning to make the cheap meat taste like something worth sitting down for. Baked in a loaf pan until the top browned and cracked, sliced thick and covered in a dark brown gravy made from the drippings. Served with mashed potatoes and green beans, or sometimes with rice in a roll. This was the midweek special at diners that needed to keep costs low when the weekend leftovers were gone and the next big cook had not started yet. The meatloaf was never fancy, and nobody expected it to be. It was the plate a person ordered when the day had been long, and what they wanted most was something warm, heavy, and familiar. The gravy held it all together. Without it, the plate was just meat and starch. With it, the plate was a reason to come back the next day. Number 8, boiled peanuts. Raw green peanuts simmered in heavily salted water for hours until the shells softened and the nuts inside turned from crunchy to something closer to a boiled bean, soft and salty and warm. Sold from a pot on the counter or from a metal basin near the front door, scooped into a paper bag or a styrofoam cup. Boiled peanuts were not on the menu in the formal sense. They were the thing a person grabbed while waiting for the real order to come out of the kitchen. Children bought a cup with pocket change. Adults peeled them one-handed while talking to the person next to them at the counter. The pile of wet shells in the trash can by the register told the cook how the day had gone before she counted the money. Number 7, vinegar pie, a filling made from sugar, butter, eggs, a splash of vanilla, and a generous pour of white vinegar mixed together and poured into a pie crust, then baked until the top puffed and cracked like a meringue and the inside set into a custard that was sweet, tangy, and sharp all at once. The vinegar pie confused people who had never heard of it. The name alone kept some customers from ordering a slice, but the ones who knew it ordered it every time because there was nothing else on the dessert board that tasted like it. The pie came from a tradition of making dessert from whatever the pantry held when fruit was out of season and money was short. No berries, no peaches, no chocolate, just staples that every kitchen already had. The vinegar gave the filling a brightness that kept it from tasting like pure sugar, and the eggs gave it body. A properly baked vinegar pie had a texture somewhere between a chess pie and a lemon meringue without the lemon, and the crack across the top was the sign that the cook had pulled it from the oven at the right moment. Black-owned diners in the rural South served vinegar pie as the house dessert when nothing else was available, and some cooks made it their signature even when pecan pie or cobbler sat next to it on the counter. A cook who could turn vinegar, sugar, and eggs into something a customer chose over cobbler was a cook who understood that skill, not ingredients, was what separated a diner worth the walk from one that was not. The pie survived longer than most items on this list because the ingredients never became hard to find. Vinegar does not go out of season, sugar does not spoil, but the cook who knew the proportions by memory and never checked the recipe, she did go out of season. And when she did, The pie went with her because the next person who tried to make it followed a written recipe and wondered why it did not taste the same. Number 6, pork brains and scrambled eggs. Canned pork brains rinsed, broken into small pieces, and scrambled in a skillet with eggs, salt, pepper, and a little butter until the mixture set into soft, creamy curds, served with biscuits or toast. The brains gave the eggs a richness and a silky texture that no amount of butter or cream could replicate, and the taste was mild enough that a person who did not know what was in the skillet might not have guessed. Diners that served brains and eggs put them on the breakfast board and watched the room divide. The people who ordered it ate in quiet satisfaction. The people who would not touch it watched from the other end of the counter with visible discomfort. Nobody was neutral. The plate did not allow it. When the supply of canned pork brains thinned out in grocery stores, the dish disappeared from diner menus without a formal farewell. Number 5, fried mullet. Whole mullet cleaned, scored on both sides, rolled in seasoned cornmeal, and fried until the skin turned crisp enough to shatter and the flesh inside stayed moist and flaky, served with coleslaw, hot sauce, and white bread. Mullet was a coastal fish that nobody with money wanted, which made it perfect for a diner that needed to feed a full house for almost nothing. The fish had a stronger flavor than trout or bass, and the people who grew up eating it on the Gulf Coast or along the rivers of the Carolinas never considered that a flaw. It was the taste of the water they knew. Inland diners served mullet when a fisherman drove up from the coast with a cooler in the back of a truck. The fish appeared without warning and sold out before supper. Nobody advertised it. The smell from the fryer was the advertisement. Number 4, tomato sandwich. 2 slices of soft white bread, a thick layer of mayonnaise on each slice, and a ripe summer tomato cut into rounds and laid across the bottom piece. Salt and pepper, nothing else. The tomato sandwich appeared on diner counters in July and August when the garden tomatoes came in heavy and red and warm from the vine. It was the simplest thing on the menu and the one most likely to start a conversation at the counter, because everyone who ordered one had an opinion about the bread, the thickness of the tomato, and whether one brand of mayonnaise was the only acceptable choice. The sandwich cost almost nothing. The tomato did all the work, and a good one needed no help from anything except salt. Number 3, hoe cake. A thin cake of cornmeal, water, and salt cooked on a greased griddle or directly in a hot skillet until the bottom crisped and the top set flat. No flour, no eggs, no leavening. The hoe cake was the oldest bread on any diner menu in the South, older than biscuits and older than loaf bread. One story holds that the name came from the field hoe that workers used to cook it over an open fire, though some historians trace the word to older English terms for any flat griddle cake. Either way, the recipe had not changed in centuries because there was nothing to change. It was already as simple as food could get. Diners served hoe cakes alongside beans, greens, or fish, and the cake soaked up whatever liquid sat next to it on the plate. Eating a hoe cake at a Black-owned diner in the South was eating something that connected the table to a history most cookbooks refused to print. Number 2, buttermilk pie, a filling of buttermilk, sugar, eggs, butter, vanilla, and a spoonful of flour, whisked together, poured into a pie crust, and baked until the center barely set and the top turned golden with dark spots where the butter had risen and caramelized. The pie tasted tangy and sweet at the same time, and the texture sat between a custard and a pudding, smooth enough to melt on the tongue, but firm enough to hold a clean slice. Buttermilk pie was the dessert a cook made when the icebox held nothing but the basics and the customers expected something sweet after lunch. It required no special ingredients, no trip to the store, and no decoration. A plain golden top with a few brown spots was the only ornament it needed. The flavor was quiet, and the people who loved it were not looking for noise. Number 1, red rice. White rice cooked in a pot with tomato, onion, a piece of smoked meat, salt and pepper until every grain absorbed the color and flavor of the tomato and turned a deep, even red. The dish came from West Africa, carried across the ocean by people who were given no choice in the crossing, and it survived because the technique required nothing that the South did not already grow. Tomatoes were cheap, rice was cheaper, the smoked meat was whatever the kitchen had. A pot of red rice could feed 20 people for the cost of a few pounds of grain and a can of tomatoes. In the dining rooms of Black-owned diners across the Low Country, the Carolinas, and the Gulf Coast, it sat at the center of the plate the way it had sat at the center of a tradition for centuries. The diner is gone. The rice remembers where it came from. Number 21, wild garlic. It pushed up through cold ground in late winter, weeks before anything in the garden stirred, and the smell gave it away before the leaves were visible. Freed families pulled the small bulbs from the forest floor and field edges and used them to season everything from potlikker to stewed game. The flavor was sharper than cultivated garlic, almost hot, and a few crushed bulbs could turn a bland pot of greens into something worth sitting down for. Wild garlic grew in dense clusters and came back year after year from the same spot. A family that knew where a good patch grew could walk out on a cold February morning with nothing and come back with enough seasoning to carry the kitchen until the planted onions were ready. Before those dishes hit the table, something simpler was already simmering on the back burner. Stewed tomatoes and okra, cooked together in one pot the way West African women had done for centuries before their recipes crossed the Atlantic. Okra came to the American South through the transatlantic slave trade, carried in the memory of enslaved people who knew its value as both food and thickener. The dish was nothing complicated. Fresh okra sliced into rounds, tomatoes chopped rough or a can of whole ones when the season passed, onion, garlic, salt, and pepper all simmered in cast iron until the okra released its silk and the tomatoes broke down into a thick, tangy stew. Some added salt pork for depth, others kept it meatless and let the vegetables speak. In the 1940s and 50s, this was a garden-to-table meal long before anyone used that phrase. Grown out back, picked that morning, cooked by lunchtime. It fed without asking much in return. Number 22, sassafras root tea. Across the Black South, sassafras was medicine and dessert in one cup. Grandmothers dug the roots from the woods, boiled them in a kettle, and served the tea hot or cold. The flavor was sweet, earthy, and unmistakable. Children begged for it. It was the original flavor behind root beer before the companies stripped it out. In 1960, the Food and Drug Administration banned safrole, the primary compound in sassafras bark, after laboratory studies linked it to liver damage in rats. That ruling turned a centuries-old tea into a federally controlled product. Today, sassafras bark can only be sold legally if the safrole has been removed, which strips the flavor that made it sassafras. The tea every grandmother in the rural South knew how to make is, in its original form, a banned substance. Number 24, wood sorrel. Small, clover-shaped leaves with a sharp, sour bite that made the mouth pucker on contact. Wood sorrel grew in shaded ground across the entire South, under trees, along creek banks, and at the edges of the woods, where the sun barely reached. Freed children chewed the stems raw for the tart juice while they worked or walked. The leaves were tossed into a pot of greens to cut the heaviness of the fat, or brewed into a sour tea when nothing else was available to drink. The plant was too small to harvest in bulk, but it grew everywhere, and a handful added brightness to a meal that had none. Nobody planted wood sorrel, nobody weeded it, nobody owned it, and nobody could stop it from growing. Salmon croquettes came out of a pink can and landed in a cast iron skillet, and in every black kitchen from Mississippi to Memphis, the sound of them frying meant somebody's grandmother was home. She drained the canned salmon, picked through the bones, though some left them in, mashed right into the mix for calcium, and that's how you knew she'd been doing this long before you were born. The salmon was folded with egg, crushed saltines, diced onion and black pepper, shaped into patties by a feel. Fried golden until the edges crisped, they came out smelling like Friday night in a house where money was short, but food never was. Canned salmon cost less than fresh meat and kept without refrigeration, making it the protein that fed the Great Migration north. Served with grits or white bread, hot sauce on the side, nobody's recipe matched because nobody's grandmother mixed hers the same way twice. The croquette survived her, the way it tasted didn't. Number 24, raw milk straight from the cow. Milk in the 1960s. Black South meant one thing, a tan pail carried from the barn to the kitchen, still warm, unpasteurized, full of cream that rose to the top by supper time. Children drank it at breakfast. Mothers poured it into cornbread batter. Nobody filtered it through a federal agency. Today, the sale of raw milk is banned outright in roughly 20 states, and federal law prohibits selling it across state lines. The Food and Drug Administration classifies it as a public health risk. The same milk that raised 3 generations of children in the Mississippi Delta is now treated like a controlled substance in states like Georgia and Louisiana, where selling a single gallon carries a fine that would have covered a month of groceries in 1963. Number 23. Wild strawberries, smaller than a fingertip and sweeter than anything a seed catalog could promise. Wild strawberries ripened in late spring along sunny banks, open meadows, and the grassy edges of old fields. Freed families, especially children, gathered them by the handful, staining fingers and mouths red in the process. The berries were too fragile to store, so they were eaten on the spot or carried home in a cup and mashed into cornbread batter or stirred into fresh buttermilk. There was no way to cultivate them deliberately. They fruited where they pleased and disappeared into the grass the moment the season turned. A patch of wild strawberries in a known clearing was a family secret worth keeping, passed from mother to daughter without a word written down. Smothered cabbage with smoked meat was Tuesday night supper, Thursday night supper, sometimes every night when the paycheck ran thin and a head of cabbage cost next to nothing. The cabbage was cored, sliced thick, and dropped into a heavy pot with smoked turkey legs or whatever cured pork was in the house, often just a ham hock end left from Sunday. Onions went in first, sweated in bacon drippings, then the cabbage piled on top, seasoned with garlic powder, black pepper, red pepper flakes, and a splash of vinegar. Covered tight and cooked low for close to an hour, the leaves broke down into something silky, soaked through with smoky broth until every bite tasted slow cooked. It was a full meal for the price of one vegetable and a leftover bone. Kids ate it, kids, without complaint because there was nothing else and because it was actually good, and grown folks ate it because their mothers had made it the same way in the same kind of pot without ever once checking a recipe. Number 20. Squirrel sold from the back of a truck, fried squirrel with gravy, squirrel dumplings, squirrel stew cooked low with onions and bay leaves. In the 1960s Black South, squirrel was everywhere. Men hunted them before dawn, skinned them on the porch, and sold clean carcasses from the tailgate for 50 cents a piece. Today, the law draws a hard line. Hunt it with a license, fine. Sell it, and you are committing a wildlife commerce violation that can mean fines, license revocation, and in some states, jail time. The tailgate, the truck, the 50-cent squirrel, that entire roadside economy is gone. Not because anyone stopped eating squirrel, because the state decided who gets to profit from what comes out of the woods. And the answer for a man with a rifle and a pickup was nobody. Number 22, cattail. The tall brown top plants that lined every pond, ditch, and wet low spot in the South offered more edible parts than almost any other wild plant. Freed families pulled the young spring shoots from the mud and peeled them down to a white, tender core that could be eaten raw or sliced into a pot of stew. The roots were dug in fall and winter, dried and pounded into a starchy flour that stretched cornmeal when the barrel ran low. The pollen from the green flower spikes, gathered by shaking them into a cloth, made a fine yellow powder that mixed into bread dough. The same plant that filled a ditch nobody wanted also filled gaps in a kitchen that had almost nothing on the shelf. If you had to ask what tomato gravy was, you weren't from the Delta. Across the Black Belt of Alabama and the Mississippi Delta, tomato gravy over white rice was breakfast before church and supper after a long shift. The gravy started with bacon drippings in a hot skillet, a spoonful of flour stirred until it darkened, just past blonde, then canned tomatoes, crushed by hand and poured in. Salt, pepper, a pinch of sugar to cut the acid, and enough water to thin it into something that poured but still clung to a spoon. It bubbled low while the rice steamed, always long grain, always cooked until each grain stood alone. The color told you everything. Too pale meant the roux wasn't ready. Too dark meant you'd walked away. And in those kitchens, you did not walk away from the stove. Poured hot over rice in a shallow bowl, it cost almost nothing and filled you until noon the next day. Number 23, home smoked sausage sold door to door. A man with a smokehouse in the 1960s Black South was a man with a livelihood. He cured his own pork, seasoned it with cayenne and sage, stuffed it into natural casings, and hung it over hickory coals for days. Neighbors bought links by the pound, wrapped in newspaper, no label, no barcode, no inspection sticker. Federal law now requires every piece of meat sold to consumers to pass through a government-inspected facility. That requirement does not distinguish between a factory floor and a man's backyard smokehouse. The smokehouse did not disappear because people stopped wanting the sausage. It disappeared because the law made the sausage a crime. Number 25, lamb's quarters. This weed grew in every disturbed patch of soil across the Deep South, along fence rows, at the edges of plowed fields, and in the bare dirt around cabin doors. Freed families picked the young leaves before the plant flowered and cooked them the same way they cooked any pot green, simmered with a scrap of salt pork until the leaves went soft and dark. The flavor was mild and earthy, closer to spinach than to collards, and the leaves were tender enough that children could eat them without complaint. Lamb's quarters grew so aggressively that pulling it up one week meant a fresh crop the next. The plant needed nothing from anyone. It showed up wherever the ground was broken and kept coming back until frost. Chow chow relish sat in mason jars on the top shelf of the pantry, and you knew a woman by the color of hers. Made from the last of the garden, green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, bell peppers, sometimes hot peppers if the family liked heat. The vegetables were chopped fine, salted overnight, then cooked down in vinegar with mustard seed, celery seed, and turmeric until the kitchen smelled sharp enough to water your eyes. Every jar was different because every garden was different and every grandmother seasoned by instinct. In the rural Deep South through the 1960s, chow chow was preservation itself, a way to keep summer alive through January. Spooned over beans, peas, greens, or eaten straight with bread, It added a tangy, sweet bite that cut through the heaviness of winter cooking. The tradition ran deep in Black households. Across the Carolinas and Alabama, a woman who didn't put up her chow chow by October was talked about at church. Number 25, possum. In the 1960s rural South, a baked possum with sweet potatoes was a winter staple that nobody thought twice about. Families trapped them in the yard, cleaned them in the shed, and roasted them on Sunday. The meat was dark, greasy, and rich enough to carry a whole table. Today, selling possum meat is illegal in every southern state under wild game sale prohibitions. A man can still trap one with a license in most places, but the moment money changes hands, it becomes a wildlife commerce violation. The law did not ban the animal. It banned the economy that grew around it, the one where a man could trap 3 on a Friday night and sell 2 to his neighbor by Saturday morning. Number 20, fox grapes. Smaller and more sour than their muscadine cousins, fox grapes grew on climbing vines through the trees along creek bottoms and forest edges across the upper South. The skins were tough and the seeds were large, but the juice was intensely flavored, dark purple and sharp enough to make the face tighten. Freed families gathered them in early fall and cooked the fruit down with whatever sweetener they had into a thick jelly that went on biscuits and cornbread through the cold months. The juice was also drunk straight, diluted with water, or left to ferment in a covered jar. Fox grapes were too sour for most people to eat fresh, but cooked down and sweetened, they produced a preserve no cultivated grape could match. Crackling bread showed up every year when the hog was killed, and if you grew up in the deep South before the 1970s, you can still hear the crunch. Cracklings, the crispy bits of pork skin left after rendering lard, were folded into cornmeal batter with salt and a little water, then baked in a greased skillet until the outside turned hard and golden. The bread came out dense, rich and smoky, nothing like anything from a box. During hog killing season, usually late November when the air turned cold enough to keep meat from spoiling, every piece of the animal found purpose, and the cracklings were the cook's reward. WPA narratives from formerly enslaved people describe crackling bread as a plantation staple, and it carried forward into free households without needing a name change. It was poor people's bread that tasted richer than anything money could buy. Here is something worth naming. Every food on this list was legal, not because someone checked, but because no one was watching. The Black South of the 1960s ran on a food economy that existed almost entirely outside the reach of federal regulators. Families hunted, butchered, smoked, canned, and sold what they produced, not because they were breaking rules, but because the rules had not been written yet. What changed was not the food. What changed was the reach. The Wholesome Meat Act of 1967, the expansion of the Food and Drug Administration through the 1970s, state health codes written for commercial restaurants and applied without adjustment to a grandmother selling plates from her front porch. These laws were not designed to target Black families, but they landed on Black families hardest because Black families were the ones whose survival depended most completely on the very practices these laws made illegal. Number 19, sumac berries. The fuzzy red clusters of staghorn sumac grew along roadsides at the edges of cleared land and in open sunny ground across the entire South. Freed families gathered the ripe berry clusters in late summer, soaked them in cold water, and strained the liquid through cloth to produce a tart, pink drink that tasted close enough to lemonade that it carried the same name in some communities. The drink was served cold when it could be, warm when it could not, and required no sugar to be drinkable, though a spoonful of honey or sorghum smoothed the edge. Sumac grew in places nobody planted it and produced clusters heavy enough that a single afternoon of gathering supplied enough dry berries to brew the drink for weeks. Crackling cornbread was the dressed-up cousin of crackling bread. Same cracklings, but stirred into a proper batter with buttermilk and egg, then baked until the top cracked and the bottom crust turned dark against the cast iron. The skillet had to be preheated with lard until it smoked, and the batter had to sizzle the second it hit the pan. That's how you got the crust, and the crust was everything. The cracklings inside gave each bite a burst of salt and pork fat that plain cornbread couldn't touch. Hog killing day in the Deep South from the 1930s through the 60s was an all-hands event. Men handled the slaughter while women rendered lard, made sausage, and baked this bread to feed the workers. The cracklings had to go into the batter while still warm, or they turned chewy and lost their bite. That timing was the secret nobody wrote down. Number 21, blackbird pie. In the cotton fields of Arkansas and the Mississippi Delta, blackbirds were not pests. They were protein. Families shot them by the dozen with pellet guns, plucked them in the yard, and baked them into pies with flour, gravy, and onion. Cheap, filling, and available to anyone with the patience to sit in a field at dusk. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act makes it a federal offense to kill, sell, or possess most native songbirds, with fines reaching $15,000 per violation. Enforcement tightened sharply through the 1960s and 1970s. A blackbird pie that fed a family of 6 in 1964 would today constitute multiple counts of a federal wildlife crime. The birds are still in the fields. The right to eat them is not. Every one of those 25 plates came from a room that somebody built with their own hands in a country that refused to seat them anywhere else. Some of those buildings were torn down for highways. Some were sold when the cook could no longer stand at the stove. A few just locked the door one evening and never unlocked it again. But the food did what the buildings could not. It traveled. It crossed state lines in the memory of everyone who ever sat at those counters. If one of those dishes brought back a name, a street corner, or a woman behind a stove you have not thought about in years, put it in the comments. Not the recipe, the place, because somebody should know it stood there.